This is a real grain to glass whiskey. This week, let me tell you about the inaugural release from Curraghmore Irish whiskey. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this is the inaugural release from Curraghmore Irish whiskey. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, first off, I'm going to say that Curraghmore were very nice, and they did send me this bottle for the review. They didn't ask me to give them a positive review. They're probably hoping I gave them a positive review, but they didn't ask me to give any kind of special treatment to them. They just gave me a bit more information about like the mash bill and stuff like that I will go into later on. But just letting you know up front, this whiskey was given to me for free, but I've opened the bottle and I've enjoyed it, so this review is an honest review. Now, if you've not heard of Curraghmore whiskey, I won't blame you because they're brand new. This is their inaugural release after all. Like I said, it's a grain to glass whiskey because this whiskey is made kind of by them / for them. So Curraghmore whiskey don't actually have their own distillery yet. They do have plans to make their own distillery on the grounds of the Curraghmore estate in Waterford here in Ireland, but they don't yet have a distillery. But this isn't like a sourced whiskey release that you might see from a lot of companies that make a whiskey. They kind of, they have a whiskey company and they plan to bring out their own whiskey in a few years, but they source in the meantime. This is more of a, I guess I'd use the term contract distilled, because what they did was they grew their grains on their estate, on their farm, and then they shipped them to Great Northern Distillery here in Ireland to get the whiskey distilled, and then they brought it back and matured it in Waterford. So they kind of sourced it. I mean, maybe legally it would be classified as sourced whiskey because it wasn't produced by them, but I'd say it's more of like a contract whiskey where they asked Great Northern to stop production and make a production run only using their grain, so they have the provenance of the whiskey from the grain all the way to the glass. They do have plans to make what they would call a carbon neutral distillery on the grounds of their estate, where obviously it'll be carbon neutral, very sustainable on into the future, but for the time being, they are going to be releasing these kind of contracted whiskey releases that have been made at Great Northern Distillery. This is a pot still whiskey. It's the style of whiskey that's unique to Ireland. I've talked about pot still whiskey a lot on the channel. It has to be a minimum of 30% unmalted barley, a minimum of 30% unmalted barley, and a maximum of 5% other grains. And this gives distilleries and companies a lot of freedom to play around with the mash bill. They could go 50-50, 30-70, 60-40, but what Curraghmore have decided to do was go 47.5% malted barley, 47.5% unmalted barley, and 5% oats, with all of those grains having been grown on their estate. And when you add oats to a whiskey, like I'll get into with the tasting notes, it really does change the flavor and the profile and the kind of feel of the whiskey. So by adding in those oats, you do get a different kind of whiskey, and that's one of the reasons I do love pot still whiskey, because it gives companies and distilleries and distillers a lot of freedom to play around and explore new profiles and new flavor categories. This comes in at 46% ABV, and it is non-chill filtered and at natural color. And I mean, that's a pretty dark natural color. I've seen younger whiskies with less color. I've seen older whiskies with less color. I've seen whiskies with caramel color added that have less color than this, and that probably speaks to the casks used in this blend. So it is a blend of 3 different kind of pot still components. It's all pot still using the same mash bill, but it's made up of 3 different casks. One was a very large Oloroso sherry cask, one was a small 100-litre virgin French oak cask, and one was a kind of a standard ex-bourbon barrel. So those 3 different components have gone into here, and it probably says they sourced some good casks to get some really nice color, because the whiskey in this blend is between 4 and 5 years old. The bourbon is about 5 years old, and the other 2 components, the Oloroso sherry and the virgin oak, are each 4 years old. So this is I'd say it's about 4.5-year-old whiskey, which has some very nice color to it. Like I said earlier, this is their inaugural release. This is their very first release, but they do have plans for more releases in the future. Next year, in 2024, they'll be releasing single casks of each of the components, the Oloroso sherry, the virgin oak, and the bourbon cask, for releases in between January and June, they said. So there's plans for the future for more whiskies from them. They do say that maybe in the future they'll be making pot still and malt whiskey, but for the time being, it'll all be single pot still Irish whiskey. So that's enough talking about the whiskey. It always doesn't really matter how the bottle looks, how the whiskey looks. What always matters is how it tastes. So let's go in for the nose on the Curraghmore Inaugural release. It's sweet. There's a lot of lemon. There's bright fruits there, but there's this really good like oaty, biscuity vibe coming through. But it's not like a baked biscuit. Not like when you cook a biscuit and you get those kind of sugars to caramelize. It's more like a bread dough kind of vibe coming through on the nose. It's almost like a porridge, but it's not as creamy as a porridge. Like it is quite creamy. There's like almost like a banana custard vibe coming through, but I'm getting more of that kind of oaty dough kind of vibe coming through, but that's not all I get. There's also some brighter notes, maybe a bit of like almost lemon coming through as well as a little bit of darker fruits, kind of maybe from those sherry notes coming through. Yeah, there's definitely some fruitiness in there. Maybe almost going to like a tropical fruit, like a pineapple, but maybe not as bright as a pineapple. Maybe like a mango, like that kind of almost syrupy, sweet, fruity note coming through. There are spices in here, but I wouldn't say they're like oak spice or like the traditional maybe like peppery pot still spice. It's more baking spices. Like there's a good bit of cinnamon in here on the nose as well. Yeah, there is a lot to kind of unpack on the nose. Like there is that oaty kind of addition to the whiskey has definitely had a good impact because it does stand out a little bit. It adds that extra creamy kind of texture to the whiskey, at least on the nose, but we're gonna go see if it has translated through to the palate. Cheers. It's spicy, it's rich, it's creamy, it's oily, it's very dense on the palate. It's also quite spicy. It's almost akin to like that kind of earthy, licoricey rye spiciness you'd expect in a rye whiskey, but there's obviously no rye in here because I'm not going to get into the science of it, but when you add different grains to a whiskey, you're not just adding less barley, you're not just adding less unmalted barley, you're also adding more of the oats. So the chemical reaction between the oats and the barley, or those new grains you've added in, do change the way the whole palate tastes, and it has almost made a bit of that kind of rye spicy earthy note come through, but it's still very creamy with all that oat characteristic coming through as well. It doesn't feel very young on the palate. Like it is rich. It doesn't have any of that kind of sharp, bright ethanol notes coming through. As I'm talking, I was getting also a little bit of like orange flesh, not like the orange zest, but like the flesh, like the orange segments in the middle of the orange coming through. So I'm gonna go in for another sip and see what else I can find. Yeah, before I get to that kind of orangey note, because that's maybe more into the finish, on the palate you definitely get a lot of that oat influence, but it's also, there's like maybe some dark berries, again maybe from that sherry influence. The dark berries, almost like maybe blackberries, but they're soaked in syrup. Like it's quite a syrupy feeling on the whiskey. And there's also that oak spice coming through, like a small amount of it. 100 litres went into the blend, was aged in that virgin French oak, and French oak can give you this kind of dark, kind of not spicy oak, but almost like dark chocolate kind of note, and that's what I'm getting here a little bit. Has a little bit of those darker oak notes coming through on the palate. And as I'm talking, I'm getting more of that finish, so I think it's time I go in for the finish. Cheers. Yeah. On the finish, as you talk, you get that kind of orange flesh coming up. The oaky spices is still there. It's less of that baking spice I was getting on the nose, more that oak spice lingering on. The creamy kind of mouthfeel you get from that oat influence, like the porridge, the bread dough. As I'm talking, as I'm breathing, that's coming up, but it's not lasting forever. And the oak spice is kind of what's lingering on more. Like the finish is, I'd say it goes into long territory. Like it is oily, it is creamy, it is sticking. Not all the notes do stick around, but as I'm talking, that oak spice, a little bit of like that creamy porridge kind of feeling there, and that orange flesh, as I'm talking, that's what I'm getting. Like I've just taken a bite of the flesh of an orange segment, and that's kind of what I'm getting lingering on into the finish. Before I give my final thoughts on this whiskey, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews every Wednesday. I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday. So if you want to see more like that, make sure you scroll down and hit that thumbs up button and hit that subscribe button. And while you're there, leave me a comment and say what whiskeys you'd like to see me review in future. Now, as to this whiskey here, it's actually a very nice whiskey. Even though it's between 4 and 5 years old, it doesn't really feel it. If you're familiar with me on Instagram or other videos I've done, I'm a member of the Irish Whisky Society, and we recently featured the Curraghmore Inaugural release as one of our spotlight whiskies of our monthly tasting. And we kind of gave it to people blind, let them taste it, and most people came back saying it was a very nice, very good whiskey. They figured out it was a pot still whiskey, but they didn't really know it was oat in the mash bill, and most people thought it was 5 to 7 years old. So it is a pretty good whiskey. Most people did think it was a very, very nice whiskey. But one thing I will say about this whiskey is it might not be for everyone because of the price of this whiskey. Though this bottle of whiskey does retail at €195, which is a lot of money no matter who you are. And while yes, I'm very grateful to them for sending me this bottle, €195 is a lot of money, so I wouldn't say I'd necessarily recommend this bottle for everyone. Now, that said, I'm taking the €195 price point on this as almost like a statement that they're going to be here for a long time. Like their releases they've got planned next year, probably not going to be in that same price. This is their inaugural release. It says it on the back of the bottle, it says it on the front of the bottle. So this is kind of maybe in that collector's item territory as opposed to the kind of drinking whiskey territory. It is a very nice whiskey. It's very definitely, I've opened my bottle, so it's not a collector's item anymore. It's definitely going to be for drinking and for enjoying. But if you maybe like the sound of the whiskey, but €195 is maybe a bit too much for you, hold on. They will have more releases coming in 2024, and you can try out what they're making for yourself, because I would say if some of the famous distilleries here in Ireland like Teeling or Dingle or the bigger brands could go back in time, now that they know how big they are, and sell their inaugural whiskey at a higher price, they probably would. So I'm hoping not every whiskey from them is going to be in that price point, because it will lock a lot of people out of being able to taste and enjoy this whiskey. But if you like the sound of it, hold on, there will be more whiskeys in the future. And if you want to maybe add this to your collection, go ahead and do that. Like I said, the 3 whiskey releases next year will have the 3 components that went into this blend, so it could be an interesting deconstruction, but that price might just put a few people off. But I'd say hold on. So I think that's everything there is to say about this whiskey. Like I said, I do really enjoy it. I am going to be enjoying this maybe a bit slowly because it is that inaugural special whiskey, but I'm definitely going to enjoy this glass, and I will see you next time. Sláinte.